Before we progress any further with our scene, there's a little bit of housekeeping that needs to be done. Up until now, we've been adding objects to our scene and we've been scaling them to size. That works well, but there is something that we need to be aware of. If I select this slide, for example, we can see its scale values here. When we create an object, by default, its scale will be set to 1 on all axes. And we can see that if I hit the backspace key while rolling over the scale value, that will take our slide and reset it back to the default cube. And you can see here our scale values are 1 and our dimensions are back to 2 meters on all axes. So if I just hit Ctrl Z to undo that, you can see obviously our scale values are now not 1. That's fine with a simple scene like this, but once we start to do anything more complicated, that can lead to some complications. Now to demonstrate this, I'm just going to add in a new object. I'm going to add in a cube. I've already shown you the edit mode where we can go in and we can manipulate the points on an object. We've seen that just by selecting all of the vertices and moving them up and down up to now to move them around the origin point, but we can actually go in and select points and deform the shape of an object in edit mode. But if I go back into object mode, within Blender we also have what are called modifiers. Now over in the property panel over here, we've got this wrench icon. If I click on that, we can add a series of modifiers that are designed to do all sorts of different things. One of the modifiers that we can add is a bevel modifier. And what this will do, as you can see, is it will round out the edges of an object. Now in the properties here, we can adjust the amount value, and that will obviously adjust how much we're rounding that out, and we can adjust the number of segments to smooth out that effect and get a far more rounded shape. The benefit of modifiers is that they are non-destructive, by which I mean we can add this in, we can adjust the mesh, but we can then go on and do other things, interact with other objects, come back here, and we can further adjust this effect very quickly and easily. And we can turn off the visibility of an effect and turn it back on again. And we can add in different modifiers and remove them at any point in the process. This is very different to going in and editing the mesh directly, in which case any changes that we make are destructive. They will be committed to the mesh and we can't easily adjust them afterwards. So you can see the effect of this bevel modifier is to round out the edges on the object. If I now remove this cube, I'll just hit X to delete and select this slide object and try to add the same bevel modifier to it, you'll see as we increase the amount here, the effect is very different. We are actually rounding out the edges to a different degree on all sides. That is not the effect that we're going to want, and the reason for that is because of that scale that we added in at the start. And if we round this out, you can see we're actually rounding the edges far more than we want. So these scale values are modulating the effect of this bevel modifier. And so what we can do, I can just hit that little X and that will remove the modifier from the object. Now what we need to do is to reset this scale value without adjusting the shape of the object. And the way to do that is if we hit the Control A shortcut, we'll bring up a little menu here, and this will allow us to apply certain values, and that means we can apply the scale. If I click on that, you can see our shape has not changed, but our scale has now been locked off to 1. So now if I were to scale this object, and then if I were to reset the scale, it will just jump back to the size that we have defined, not back to its default cube. The only way to get it back to that default cube would be now to adjust these dimensions back to 2 meters on all axes. Now if I go into the modifiers tab and I add in the same bevel modifier, you can see that the effect is very different. I can now adjust this value. If I hold down the shift key to adjust it in small increments, you can see I can now round out the corners here. I can increase the number of segments if I want. And now you can see I get a nice rounded corner on all of the edges. And this is really important when it comes to actually shading and rendering your scene. You can see now we're catching light on this edge. It gives us a far more natural result than having these razor sharp edges that you normally get on a default object. So for now, I'm going to remove that bevel modifier from that object, and you'll see why a little bit later. But what we need to do is to select all of these other objects, and we need to apply the scale to all of them. And it's simple enough. We can just drag select over all of our objects here, and we can hit the Control A shortcut and select scale to apply the scale. And you can see now if we select any of these objects, the scale will be 1 on all axes.